different regulators that focus on different aspects. Often it's been driven by the UN Convention Against Corruption and countries seeking to fulfill their commitments under the convention. But I think we've also seen in the last year, with a lot of focus on corruption during the COVID pandemic, that there's also a move towards developing more anti-corruption institutions and regulation as a result of that. So in this session, we would like to explore this variation and ask questions about what works best in different contexts from three experts who are from different parts of the world. The format will be as follows. First of all, we will hear from our three speakers about the situation in their countries, and I'll introduce them in a moment. We'll then have a moderated discussion in which I will ask the speakers some questions for about half an hour. And then for at least the last half an hour, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. And at that stage, I would ask you, if you have questions, if you could please type them into the chat function and I will collect them up from there. In general, if you could have your microphones on mute throughout the session, we would appreciate that. You're welcome to have cameras on if you would like to. Okay, so moving over to our speakers then, we have three fantastic speakers with us today. First of all, we have Laura Alonso. Laura is the former head of the Anti-Corruption Office of Argentina. She was in that role from 2015 to 2019. And under that, in that role, she directed the implementation of the public ethics law and the first national anti-corruption plan. So some fantastic experience there. Previously, she had also been chair of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, and hence in that role also has a lot of experience and overview of the G20, different strategies among the G20 countries on anti-corruption. She's previously been elected a member of the Honorable Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the Argentine National Congress, and previously she was executive director of the Argentine chapter of Transparency International. Second, we have Jungoh Son from South Korea. Jungoh is currently part of the global anti-corruption team in the Bureau for Policy and Programme Support at the United Nations Development Programme. He's based in Singapore, and he's providing policy support, identifying entry points and helping with the upscaling of corruption prevention tools. And he is particularly helping out newly established anti-corruption agencies. And that builds on his experience previously. For almost a decade, he was with the Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission in South Korea. And last but definitely not least, we have my colleague, Robert Barrington. Robert is the Professor of Anti-Corruption Practice at the Centre for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. He was formerly the head of Transparency International UK, and he is currently also chair of Transparency International's International Council. At TI UK, he led the campaigns to secure the Bribery Act, a national anti-corruption strategy for the UK, and the introduction of unexplained wealth orders. And before that, he had experience in the City of London at F&C Asset Management, and as the CEO of the environmental research group, Earthwatch Institute. So I think you can see we've got a fantastic range of expertise and experience with us from three continents. I'm now going to hand over to the speakers, and we'll have initial 5 minutes introduction to the governance of corruption in their own countries. So Laura, if I could turn to you first to give us an overview of what institutions you have in Argentina for preventing, investigating and prosecuting corruption, and tell us something about how they've evolved over time and how adequate you think they are.
Hi, Liz, and hi to everyone and the colleagues here in the panel. It's great to meet you. It's going to be complicated to shorten this in 5 minutes. So just speaking from experience, Argentina is a federal country with a central government and 24 subnational governments. I'm going to speak about the national and the federal structure, but not the provincial structure. In many subnational governments or provinces, we don't even have, for example, public ethics laws. So just to give you a state of the art in the country, the development of the anti-corruption policy and the institutions throughout the past 25 years has been very related to political changes in the government. So I don't want to escape to this discussion. There have been governments with some political color more open to set anti-corruption policies and new institutions and new regulations, and other type of governments have been less committed to this agenda. But there have been progresses in the past years, at least in the federal level. New laws were passed. For example, the access to information law. Argentina didn't have an access to information law before 2016. The corporate liability legislation has been passed also. It was enacted in 2018. And other laws that are important in the anti-corruption packet. Argentina has an anti-corruption office since 1999. It was the office I was in charge of. It's a very weird type of institution, a hybrid, because it mixes policy for prevention and detection of illicit enrichment in asset declarations of public officials, but it has also it's the international focal point for Argentina at the OAS, and it interacts with other organizations, the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group, or the UN, or the Anti-Bribery Working Group at the OECD. As Argentina is not a member of the OECD, we were a couple of times invited to the senior public officials working group at the OECD, which is usually, I think it has the best standards if you want to apply in your country, if you are starting with this agenda or if you are moving forward. With regards to models, there is no perfect model. Usually you will find a lot of hybrids and imperfect institutional settings. This comes from an old book, but it's not old, by Susan Rose Ackerman. She has a couple of paragraphs speaking about why in many countries which do not have strong institutions in general, you find similar agencies with similar objectives that compete. And sometimes maybe you have an anti-corruption office that is more active and a less active prosecutor's office against corruption. So it's very different, the scenario you can find in G7 countries, for example, than in the rest of the G20 countries and in other countries. So I think that the world in the last 25 or 30 years has proved with many models, and it's a good time to recap, because technology and data and artificial intelligence is bringing, I think, a new possibility for the anti-corruption agenda, just, in the prevention or in the prevention side, but also in the investigation and the prosecution side of corruption. However, I still find that there are a lot of political disagreements, global political disagreements, about what an anti-corruption agency must look like. If you go to the FATF, you will find clear regulation, global regulation about what financial information unit means. But in the case of anti-corruption agencies, there is no global agreement about that. Even if you read the UN Convention, it's a mix of a lot of things. And when they speak about one or various anti-corruption bodies, that's it. So, you just do whatever you can. And this is not clear direction for the countries. There is no clear mandate. And I think that this is because the anti-corruption agenda, it's politically sensitive in many countries. And, I'm a political scientist, and we are in the middle of a democratic recession in the world. And I think that anti-corruption is suffering, or the anti-corruption policy and the movement is going to suffer a lot. So that's why I'm starting to think about how to use data and artificial intelligence. And as you said before, with regards to jungoh work, how to find entry points inside governments and the business sector to work with anti-corruption mandates and orientations and tools, but maybe do not say that we are doing anti-corruption while we are doing that, you know, some kind of good cheating in this way. It's more rhetoric than actionable. I think that we can do a lot of anti-corruption policy without saying that we are doing anti-corruption. And just to close this first intervention, it was also very difficult, for example, in our case, and I think it's difficult in other countries' cases where there are some similar anti-corruption offices, to access to tax information. You know, you can do now a lot of anti-corruption policy if you want to control, for example, public officials' enrichment and procurement. You need to access to two databases in your countries: tax database and the beneficial ownership registries. If you do not access to these two pieces of information and do cross massive data, you know, techniques, and you use artificial intelligence to find problems, and you create a global conversation around this, because also countries can share with others this information, we are still trapped in a 19th century model, institutional model. So we need to rethink these issues, not only domestically, but also globally. That's why I'm posing this question about what anti-corruption bodies means for the UN. And I don't think that it doesn't have any clearness in the convention. And that's why we have so many different models, a lot of entry points. But at the end, there is a lot of frustration from the people in the world with regards to anti-corruption. So we need to bring more clarity in order to put our fight for development, for sustainable development, and in the sake of a better and fair world for the people. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Laura. So no perfect model, but we could perhaps benefit from clearer guidance. Jungoh, moving on to you. Could I ask you to tell us about the situation in South Korea?
Yes, of course. Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Jungoh, a member of UNDP Global Anti-Corruption Team and a secondee from South Korean Anti-Corruption Agency. I spent 15 years in this field as drafting national anti-corruption strategy, conducting corruption risk assessment, monitoring and evaluation mechanism, and implementing whistleblower protection system. Today, I would like to share my observation and experience on the operation of ACA in South Korea. To begin with, I understand that one-size-fits-all approach does not work, but the Korean example might provide some implications on ACA's functions and enabling factors for it. Let me introduce Korea's anti-corruption governance in simple. Anti-corruption has been one of national priorities in Korea, particularly since 2017, when a high-profile corruption scandal occurred. Citizens called for strong anti-corruption interventions to prevent corruption, and the government has exerted its efforts toward the objective. Korea has decentralized government functions in the fight against corruption, and overall for recent 20 years, anti-corruption governance system had not been greatly changed. In terms of corruption prevention, Anti-Corruption and Civil Rights Commission, which was established as Korean ACA in 2002, is responsible for prevention policy formulation and implementation, integrity training, raising awareness programs. Also, it focuses on supporting each public organization to ensure anti-corruption activities in practice, while a work of public ethics, including asset declarations, is belonging to the Ministry of Personnel Management. In late 1990s, the government aimed to establish an ACA like CPIB Singapore or ICAC Hong Kong, but its mandate was limited to corruption prevention by decision made in the parliament. Law enforcement is conducted by Prosecutor's Office, National Police Agency, Supreme Audit Institution, etc. In addition, this year, the government launched a new agency, Corruption Investigation Office, for high-ranking officials that targets to curb corruption committed by high-ranking officials such as the president, parliament members, and ministers with investigatory and prosecutorial powers. Furthermore, to materialize anti-corruption objectives by bringing such institutions together, Korea has operated an interagency coordination committee chaired by the president and participated by heads of anti-corruption institutions, as well as key ministers, for example, from Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Education, and Ministry of Health and Welfare. When it comes to legal framework, South Korea has anti-corruption law, whistleblower protection law, public service ethics law, anti-solicitation law, and anti-false claim law, and penal codes. In short, I assume that this system has resulted in both achievement and limitations. Under this current system, the country's anti-corruption reputation has been improved in various international rankings, such as TICPI, as a result of introducing corruption measures and eagerly participating in the global anti-corruption regime, such as UNCTAD and OECD anti-bribery conventions. However, as indicated, high-profile cases have been continued, and many citizens are still showing skeptical attitudes on the government's actions. In this regard, as a key agency, ACRC has intensified its efforts in identifying corruption vulnerabilities, global trends, and best practices that enable Korea's anti-corruption capacity to meet people's expectations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, jungoh. And interesting here to at the end there to hear about the citizens being skeptical and how important that public confidence element is in establishing a governance of corruption. Thank you. Over then to Robert to tell us about the situation in the UK.
Thank you, Liz, and good afternoon, everybody. I came to this question of the governance of corruption through a very simple question, which is who's in charge of ensuring that a country's anti-corruption approach is successful? And the reason that was going around in my head was when I looked at the COVID crisis in the UK and issues around PPE procurement and all those issues on public procurement and COVID response, which have been faced by so many countries around the world, there's a huge amount of concern amongst the anti-corruption community and a huge amount of press coverage about how this in the UK has led to some corruption. So not entirely corrupt, but there have been quite strong suspicions about corruption. And so I was wondering whose job it was to say, yes, there's a possible problem here. We need to have a look at it. And it turns out it's not really anybody's job to do that. So that got me thinking, well, if a country has an anti-corruption agency, does it do this better or worse? And therefore, how might that apply to the UK? So I had those two basic questions in my head. Whose job is it? And do anti-corruption agencies do this better or worse than other institutional models? And then I looked at anti-corruption agencies around the world, and particularly the sort of research into them. And there are various analyses of what makes them more or less successful. I quite liked the D'Souza analysis, which I put into the chat function. You'll see here I identifies 6 key features and principles of anti-corruption agencies, which make them successful. And I was thinking, well, in the UK, if we don't have an anti-corruption agency, can we say that all these characteristics, at least, are there in whatever institutional arrangements we have? And the truth is, I don't think we can tick all those boxes. So I'm therefore sort of a little bit skeptical about whether the UK setup is fit for purpose in terms of the basic governance of corruption, those D'Souza principles, but they, those D'Souza principles are fairly common sense, I think. Things like independence and durability and specialization. What we have in the UK is dozens, literally dozens, over 60 agencies, each of which have some responsibility for corruption, plus all the police forces, and there are about 45 police forces. So there are a lot of agencies that have these responsibilities. Instantly, D'Souza's point number 2, the interinstitutional cooperation and networking, you will see is going to be very hard in those circumstances. In addition to those multiple agencies, we have one very small central unit, the Joint Anti-Corruption Unit in the Home Office, which has a relatively small staff. I have to say they're very expert and I think do a very good job, but given the size of the problem they deal with, it's very slimly resourced. And then we have what is called the Prime Minister's Anti-Corruption Champion. So the governance of corruption in the UK effectively is around this post of the Prime Minister's Anti-Corruption Champion, who I think played a role in the opening session at the this conference, the OECD Integrity Week. And I have to say there was quite a lot of concern about the fact that some comments which were not very positive about his speech were removed from the chat function by the moderators. So I think in the spirit of transparency, we should perhaps hope that the moderators of OECD will restore those comments, because I think we need to have an active debate about these things. The Prime Minister's Anti-Corruption Champion is a personal appointment by the Prime Minister and therefore doesn't fulfill point number 1 of the D'Souza list of independents. They're a backbench MP, so not an expert in corruption, so not really fulfilling point number 3, and so on and so forth. So my contention here is that the UK has probably been too complacent about corruption for too long and not really had a proper institutional structure to deal with it. But now I think the COVID crisis tells us that we probably need something a bit more robust. And I'm very interested in a discussion about whether that means the UK should have an anti-corruption agency, as Australia is thinking of and as France has just implemented, or whether there is an alternative institutional arrangement which would also meet D'Souza's principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. So that's very interesting. I mean, I think I wonder what the UK answer would be to why there is no single anti-corruption agency. And I suspect that there would be some people in government who would say, well, we don't really have a very serious corruption problem, and so we don't need one. So actually, I wonder if I could ask all 3 speakers, is it only countries with a serious corruption problem who need to have formal governance structures for corruption? And perhaps we go in reverse order. Robert, could I ask you to kick off on that, and then we'll go to Jungoh and then Laura.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think you could make a case that if a country didn't have any corruption, it wouldn't need any apparatus for the governance of a corruption response. But the truth, as we all know, is that all countries have a corruption problem of some sort. And the UK has both its own problem, domestic corruption, whether that's in COVID procurement or local government or elsewhere. It has the export of corruption through multinational companies operating overseas. And it plays this very prominent role in being a clearinghouse for the proceeds of corruption flowing through the financial system, with London as a huge financial centre in the overseas territories and so on. So, I think even if theoretically you might say a country with no corruption doesn't need an anti-corruption response, the UK is not that country. And furthermore, I think we could point to the fact that other countries which have, a similar ranking to the UK on multiple indices, not just the Corruption Perceptions Index, but other indices, like Australia and France, have introduced anti-corruption agencies, which of course is a bit of a challenge, I think, to the UK government as to why it thinks it doesn't need that kind of institutional arrangement.
Excellent, thank you. Jungoh, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think that the scope, degree, and manifestation of corruption vary from country to country. However, no country has been free from corruption. Indeed, corruption has not been eradicated throughout human history. So, I believe that all countries should have these governance structures to address corruption problem. Let me elaborate by presenting a Korean example. Before the launching of ACA, in 2000, South Korea scored 40 in CPI, while last year it reached to 61. This result could be interpreted that experts, business executives, and citizens have seen achievement in tackling corruption in Korea. But I cannot find any claims that anti-corruption agency and anti-corruption governance do not need in Korea. Instead, citizens continuously call for tackling and preventing evolved corruption schemes regarding conflict of interest, beneficial ownership, money laundering, and tax evasion. Anti-corruption effort is still needed, and its focus should be fine-tuned in a changing and evolving society. I firmly believe that any country needs some sorts of governance system to address corruption problem.
Thank you. And Laura?
Yes, thank you. I was reading what Robert shared with us, and I was thinking about what I learned when I went to the UK in 2016 or 17. You were starting there with a strategy, the anti-corruption strategy. So, for example, we didn't have strategy, we didn't have a plan, but we had an anti-corruption office and a couple of laws. So we started an anti-corruption strategy here. And what was interesting is that with the anti-corruption strategy, we were able to grow our expansion in the conversation with other agencies and ministries. So we pushed also, infrastructure, sustainable environment ministry, other ministries or other policies in the government and responsible for those policies to start thinking also in an anti-corruption way. So I found that the national strategy was a good idea as a method to start growing the conversation inside the administration. But I want to go back to something that I think it's very important, and maybe I didn't use the best concepts before. In some countries, maybe not the UK probably, but in some countries, if there is no tone from the top in the administration, there's any setting is not going to work. Do you understand what I say? If you have a president who is the head of the corruption scheme, or if you had in all senses of corruption, it can be like looting the people's monies and the public funds, or doing business and bringing businesses for your private interests. So if the main person in the administration has the power to do wrong things, it's very difficult for the rest. And in some countries, you may have independent appointments of the head, for example, of an anti-corruption agency. But if you don't have the budget, if you're not able to manage your budgets, if you cannot hire professionals because the salaries are very low, it doesn't care if you're appointed by God or if you're appointed by your neighbor. So it's a compendium of things. That's why I'm not skeptical about anti-corruption agencies, because I was a big defender and I was in charge of one for 4 years, but it's not the end solution. It's not going to end the problem. Probably it's going to start a new problem and a new discussion that it's not going to help to move the agenda. So, I think that's in a way what Jungoh said, no, there is no model that sizes everyone. It's okay, but we also need some guidance about that, and countries must, approach that guidance. If you also, let's go to the other side of the Atlantic. The US doesn't have an anti-corruption office, but they have always had a very strong Department of Justice. And that's key, and this is the basics of liberal democracy. If your judiciary is independent and it's professional, maybe you don't need an anti-corruption agency doing investigations. But maybe you need both. This is what Susan Rose Ackerman said many years ago. For example, in my country, we had in our anti-corruption office a lot of functions that were very mixed. But again, we didn't have access to the information, to the databases that are key. Beneficial ownership and tax information. And that's key to know where the money is going and coming from. So, you know, I would not recommend, if you ask me now, okay, go and create an anti-corruption office or agency, because it sounds like, okay, I label this as anti-corruption and that's it. For example, when I went to France 4 or 5 years ago or 6 years ago, there were no authorities, anti-corruption authorities, and now they created one. And I don't, you know, I'm speaking with 25 or some experiences on this from our anti-corruption office. I'm not so sure if a body, specialized body is going to work. Maybe it works, but it works if you also have a conversation with the rest of the administration about the prevention of corruption. So you can target public officials, you can have a conversation with businesses, you can have a conversation, for example, with mining, with oil and gas ministries or agencies. You can have a conversation with education ministry about, you know, how we are educating our people with regards to corruption, and how we are also training our teachers and professors about the corruption issue. So, you know, I think that the national strategy is a good idea in the sense that they are mixing all these policies together with an approach, an anti-corruption approach. But also in the past years, the OECD and others started to speak more about integrity. And I think that integrity brings a positive rhetoric in this agenda. If you say all the time that you are doing anti-corruption and everybody's corrupt, this is very negative for liberal democracy. And I have to tell you this. I think it's a very complicated rhetoric in very weak countries like developing countries that are trying to consolidate liberal democracies for some decades now. So when you have a corruption scandal in a weak liberal democracy, the ones that is affected is democracy. It's, you know, the officials are corrupt, and probably the judiciary is weak and is corrupt too. So they will get impunity. So it's a, you know, it's a balance that you may have. That's why I like to speak more when you are doing policy about integrity. But we know that we are doing anti-corruption, but we speak about integrity with a more positive rhetoric and language to support democracy, to support liberal democracy, not other models of so-called democracies. So for me, these are the things that, you know, I think every country has to solve the question with their own tools. That's, you know, there is an explanation probably why the UK is less corrupt domestically than Argentina. And we can find institutional explanations, cultural, educational, economic explanations, and political explanations, and different solutions for that. So I would not, you know, be so like, okay, now go and create an anti-corruption agency, because you're going also to create a lot of expectations in the public and in the media, and the anti-corruption office is not going to solve the problem. So every time there is an a corruption scandal, they will go to knock at the door at the anti-corruption office, and they will not be able to solve the problem, because maybe that's a problem for the judiciary at that point. When you have a scandal, it's the judiciary that needs to respond, institutionally speaking. So this is a very interesting conversation that I hope that, you know, international organizations are having. And I think that we need to set some guidance about how an institutional setting may look like, but learn from experiences. And maybe we can reach some point where we have 2, 3, 5 different models for different stages of institutional development. But at least having this conversation, I think it's very, very important and very good, because also what I have seen in the past years, in the past decades, is that we are repeating models everywhere and we are failing everywhere at the same time. you know, and we have been developing a lot of new rules and we have had a lot of scandals, but as Jungoh said, we are not satisfying the expectations of the people. And this is the key problem that we have to address. How we satisfy people's expectations with good institutional, with effective institutional responses. And again, I bring here, for prevention is one thing, and I think information, data, cooperation, networking, domestically and internationally is key. And for investigation, you need an independent judiciary. And this is the basics of liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I wonder, sort of building on that. So I think there's a sort of message coming through that an agency is not necessarily going to solve everything. But for people in the audience, perhaps, who might be thinking about starting a new agency or embarking on this, I wonder if the three of you have any advice, particularly on how you would slot it into those existing institutions. Design issues, should you start small and then widen the scope, or do you start with a big remit? And then, given this interesting discussion and themes that you've all brought up around the discourse around it, how do you set tone at the top? How do you manage this balance between integrity versus anti-corruption and not creating expectations that you can't meet? So do you have any advice on those issues for people setting out on starting up new agencies? And I'll go to Jungoh first this time, and then Robert, then Laura.
Yep, I will explore a Korean experience as well for this question. Initially, the Korean government aimed to make an ACA both with prevention and investigatory powers. The mandate of corruption prevention was totally new because 20 years ago, any Korean line ministries didn't have corruption prevention powers. But for investigation, it was considered to establish a department consist mostly of secondary or former investigating officers from existing law enforcement agencies such as General Prosecutor's Office and Police Agency. As a result, Korea launched the ACA only with prevention capacity, despite its role model was CPIB and ICAC Hong Kong. All government agencies claim more resources, so it is not possible that fully enough funds and staff are allocated to a new agency, as well as mandates. However, I want to highlight that without resources, ACA cannot pursue its intentions. In 2002, the Korean ACA started its work with 138 staff, and as implementing anti-corruption policies and getting supports from civil society, it had justification to be extended to bigger organization with more than 200 staff until 2007, within 5 years from the establishment, with more mandates and resources, and now around 250 staff of ACRC engaged in the fight against corruption. In my view, Korean experience can offer two implications. First, anti-corruption commitment can be elaborated as providing legal support and resource to the agency, and furthermore, anti-corruption commitment can design how the new established ACA can to what extent ACA can have its mandate. Second, if the agency makes performance recognized by citizens, it could have strong justification to widen its scope in terms of legal framework or in terms of resource, staffing, and funding. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Robert, your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Liz. Well, you asked if we had advice, and I feel the opposite is the case, that I'm here to receive advice rather than to dispense it. And I'm very keen to hear everybody's views about what would be a suitable governance of corruption in the UK. But I do have some observations, partly on what Laura said, actually. So it seemed to me that one of the things Laura was hinting at was you have such a diversity of interpretation around the world of an anti-corruption agency, let alone any other institutional model. Might it be useful if the UN, under the auspices of UNCAC, actually gave some clear guidance as to what a good model was? Now, there are the Jakarta principles from 2012, which are quite long and complex. So those could be a starting point. Those have never been officially adopted by UNCAC. But I'm wondering whether, you know, some kind of international level coalescing around key features might be useful as the first point. The second, again, picking up on what Laura said, this question, you know, do you call it an anti-corruption agency or an integrity commission? France's is called an anti-corruption agency. Australia's proposed one is called an integrity commission. There is, I think, a lively debate in Australia. Certainly TI Australia has entered it as to whether what is proposed in Australia is going to be fit for purpose anyway. So it's clearly a matter of the functions and not simply the name. You know, I think that positive spin in some jurisdictions will work better. So, you know, merely the terminology can be very important around this. You asked about sort of, you know, start small and grow, and, you know, how do you weave into the existing fabric? I don't know the answers, but they're clearly very important questions. I would observe that two of the sort of acknowledged successes in the anti-corruption agency world, Singapore and Hong Kong, are actually very different in size. Hong Kong is much bigger. So it's not necessarily a question of having as many staff as you know as possible. There is something else going on there as well. And just on Jungoh's point about, you know, are we better off having an agency that prevents and investigates? I would actually go a stage further and suggest that one of the institutional setups I like within the UK is the Serious Fraud Office model, what's called the Roskill model, which combines investigation and prosecution in the same entity, the Serious Fraud Office. So, you know, I would probably ideally look for an integrity commission that does prevention, investigation, and prosecution. Then you come across the subject that, or the issue that Liz was hinting at, was you will immediately start treading on the toes of lots of other agencies that exist to do that. So how do you weave that new agency into the fabric of an existing network? Do you reduce the powers of other agencies? Do you abolish other agencies? Do you replace them? You know, there is that set of questions. I don't know the answer to that, but again, I'd be very interested to hear people's experiences.
Thanks very much, Robert. And Laura, any further reflections from you, advice for those starting out on this? You're on mute.
So I was thinking when I was listening to Robert about investigating, preventing, and prosecuting. I know the SFO because I've been there twice. And that's a very specific type of organization. However, they don't deal with integrity policy holistically. And this is another issue, you know. I'm a political scientist, so I always understood anti-corruption as a general policy in the government, of course, with some specifics. So you need different types of organizations probably, or if you have them in government, you need to give them new functions that maybe they don't have. So for example, now, if I were, you know, for example, what type of public administration do we have? And in our countries, in Latin America, it's not a professional public administration. It's completely different from the UK. And I'm sure that if there is an organization inside the government that deals with the professionals in the public administration, may have a lot of powers and possibilities to train public officials, senior public officials, young public officials, you know, interns, about integrity, about how to report corruption or misconduct. So there are a lot of possibilities. I think that, you know, it's important to see what tools do you have in your government, and maybe given these agencies a new function creates a new governance against corruption. So it's not usually, I think that the easiest way to sort out very quickly and not solve the problem is to create an anti-corruption agency. You know, it sounds very good. You go to financial institutions, so you say, now, you know, I create an anti-corruption agency, checklist, that's it. I'm fine, give me the money. So even if I have to advise the IMF or the banks, development banks, but also private banks that lend money to governments and to companies, I think that they need to widen the scope about what anti-corruption means, because if you are hiring you know, politicized personnel with no capacities in the public administration, you might probably have a lot of corruption in your administration and of course inefficiency. And if you are also, if you don't have a political funding, transparent political funding model, you may have a lot of politicians bringing public funds into political campaigns, deviating them from their, you know, diverting these funds into illegal activity, which is funding political campaigns. So it's a compendium of things and policies that you need to address with an anti-corruption approach. It's the same as with human rights, you know, and I think that we need to break the silo of anti-corruption. Even, you know, for me, it's a universal policy. You need some specific, probably, people that know the rhetoric, that bring new ideas from other countries, but these people with a lot of power given by tone from the top. So if, you know, if your prime minister or your president knows about corruption in your government and they do nothing because they are part of the scheme, or they just don't want to punish that politically, it's very difficult. You can do things, you can prepare institutions, but it's going to be a huge, even titanic exercise to be alive for 4 years, for example, as I was. And I had a lot of tone from the top, and the people was demanding for anti-corruption, but people are never satisfied with the responses. Even when you have sentences of high-rank officials, even when you identify the assets, even when you try all these things, people are demanding more and more, because when you go very local, when you go to the very low levels of government, they face corruption every day with local police, with local inspectors, with local tax authorities. So, you know, it's a very huge and complex agenda that you are not going to solve with one institutions. And probably if you set an anti-corruption office that is not, and may probably be not effective in the beginning and in some time, you are going to create a lot of frustration. So it's a very difficult issue, but I think that we need to discuss this more and more and find more ideas and be open to different models. Maybe South Korea has a fantastic model that we need to look at, and maybe something that we can contribute from Argentina or other countries. But for example, oversight bodies, and I close with this. In Argentina, constitutional oversight bodies, as the audit institution, is a disaster. It was designed by the political parties that wrote the constitution 25 years ago, and it's completely politicized. So, you know, and you go to the OECD and you ask, and they say, oh, you have the worst audit institution in the world. And they are also an anti-corruption body. If you think about what an audit institution does, it's not only doing accounting, they can also do a lot of anti-corruption. So I think it's a compendium of things. And breaking the silos. I know that also Transparency International has been pushing for breaking the silos for anti-corruption. Is very important. It's very important. And even to, you know, usually I think against the tide by bringing this speech to the OECD. You know, you have to break your own silos, because when you speak about digital government, it's great. Digitization is the greatest ally for an anti-corruption prevention policy. If you have a paper-based administration, you will never have an anti-corruption policy. You may have an anti-corruption agency, but if you have a paper-based administration, it's not going to work. So that's why I was speaking about digital infrastructure. I'm speaking more about artificial intelligence and data, because also you can share data with others, not only with some oversight institutions or some controllers inside the government or the opposition or the media. You can also share this information with the citizens. And I think that we are in the right time to do it. I think that COVID has given us an excuse to start thinking out of the box.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to start moving over to the questions that we're getting from the audience. So do type your questions into the chat, but there's quite a lot going on already. So there are a couple of questions which are around the private sector. So what about the corruption in the private sector? Would it be useful or advisable to have an anti-corruption agency focused on the public sector and another one on the private sector? And we had another question which is sort of had some overlap, but also a little bit different right at the beginning. Saying agree at the national level, but how do you apply this to states' external relations with third countries? Is corruption part of diplomacy and international relations? And then on the private sector side, how do you apply it to multinationals' lobbying actions to get tenders and contracts? So if you could all start to think about answering those. And also Robert has just asked if he can respond to what Laura just said. So should we start with you, Robert?
Thank you. So I'm struck that Laura is very strongly saying that a single agency approach is flawed. And I can understand that as a sort of, as a position. The alternative is therefore a multi-agency approach. But then I return to my sort of original question, which is who's in charge if you have a multi-agency approach? If you have allegations in a country like the UK that there is corruption, chumocracy as it's called, in the COVID procurement, the PPE procurement, who's going to take an overview and say, yes, there is possibly a problem here, we need to have an investigation? Or do you just hope that that is picked up by one of the many, many other agencies, all of whom don't really want to deal with it because it's not quite their job and it's politically difficult?
Or do you want to come back on that?
You may have an agency that does administrative investigations. You can have that with that function. Yes, you receive reports and you do investigations, but you can also say, okay, we got this information and a prosecutor is going to open an investigation in the judiciary. So, I think that multi-agency, you put it in a very nice way, multi-agency approach at this time, it might be more useful, but you need to have a lot of people. But you need a champion, you need a voice in a government and administration. That if you don't have support from your president or your prime minister, politically, saying it's important to speak about transparency and to speak about corruption. And when these guys do not speak about this, there is a problem. Because as an authority, you know that this is not an issue, and you start feeling that you are not going to be supported if you find something that is wrong. So it's I also prefer multi with civil society and multi with business, because it makes you stronger. I don't like this one approach with one hero speaking about anti-corruption. They kill you in a moment, because corrupt are very powerful. So you need to create a network of people speaking about transparency at the same time. And there are a lot of tools usually in our governments and in general in our countries that we can use. But of course, maybe we can create something new, but with this idea of networking and doing anti-corruption with others and supporting each others.
Great. Robert, do you want to say anything about the private sector question?
Yep. I want to share ACRC's experience on anti-corruption efforts for private sector. So as we all know that corruption is transaction between public sector and private sector. But for private sector, anti-corruption agency, for example, ACRC Korea, we only have corruption prevention mandate, so we cannot investigate corruption allegations in private sector. So in terms of the ACRC Korea have utilized our corruption prevention mandate. For example, we have researched best practices in the global community, global best practices, and we made them for anti-corruption prevention toolkit for private sector. So by using that publication, we provided education for anti-corruption compliance department in companies. So for example, Samsung or Hyundai and some big companies didn't propose to us for such education program, but many mid and small sized firms, they don't have enough resources to have this kind of education for their own. So we strongly supported them since establishment of ACA in South Korea in 2002, and I think that this impact is not direct, but it is, although it is indirect, but we can change social norms. We can reshape social norms so that they cannot engage in the corruption practices between public actors, public organizations.
Great, thank you, Jungoh. Any other comments from our panelists on the private sector?
Yes, I want to make a comment on private sector. I don't think that it's smart to create an anti-corruption office for private sector corruption. There is corruption between the public and the private sector. And of course, there is corruption between the private sectors inside the country and with other private sectors outside the countries. But, you know, setting new regulations, creating standards, asking companies and sectors how they are dealing with this, opening a public conversation, it helps a lot. You know, when we got into the office in 2015, there was no public conversation about businesses and ethics and compliance. We started that conversation that ended in the enactment of the corporate liability legislation. We brought people from the SFO in the UK, from the SEC, from Chile, from the OECD. It helped a lot. We also used the G20 as an excuse to help our national private sector to showcase internationally that they were part of this conversation. So, you know, instead of bringing something new as a institutional police to control companies, I think it's better to invite these companies and give them the possibility, private sector, to speak about how they are dealing with this, which, you know, accepting the problem is the first step, and then adapting regulations and showing case good experiences. You know, with private sector, usually you must use a different rhetoric than with public sector. It's a different type of relationship that you have to build. But we also did something similar to what they are doing in South Korea, which is to open this conversation. We wrote a lot of guidance after the enactment of the law. And we also wrote guidance for sports organizations, how to deal with, you know, ethics and compliance in sports organizations, which is also a huge pocket of global corruption that the OECD and others are starting to speak about, and we did that with them at the G20. So, you know, this is it's massive, but also bringing new topics and new ways of dealing with corruption with the private sector, with a different rhetoric and different tools. I think it's important. And I don't want to miss the mention of state-owned enterprises. which we also address in our law and in the G20. And I think it's a huge pocket of corruption in many of our developing countries.
Yeah, excellent point, actually. Yeah, often falling between the cracks. Robert, on the private sector.
Thank you. Just a few things to say about this. I mean, the first is, as Laura was hinting there, lots of modern anti-bribery laws have resulted in government agencies creating guidance. And there's, I think, very good guidance from the French ACA accompanying the Loi Sapin II, which has just been updated. There's, of course, the DOJ guidance in the US for the FCPA, and in the UK for the Bribery Act, there's the Ministry of Justice guidance and so on. So there is already sort of state standard setting, as it were, around the issue of bribery and anti-bribery systems, just as there is really on money laundering as well in the financial services sector. But I think there are some areas that fall between the cracks. State-owned enterprises is one, and the OECD, I think, has got good guidance on that, by the way. But I think also you see this phenomenon in the UK and many other countries of the gradual outsourcing or privatization of public services. And there you find that suddenly anti-corruption mechanisms in the broader sense, like freedom of information laws, no longer apply to things that they used to apply to. And so I think that's a problem. And that is falling between the cracks a bit in our sort of global institutional defenses, that things that were set up for the public sector no longer work when things are privatized or outsourced. And the second is, there is this interface between business and politics on issues like lobbying and the revolving door, which of course is very conceptually difficult because it's hard to know when it is or is not corruption. But my observation is that the self-regulation of that has been a total failure in pretty much all jurisdictions, such that there is too close and cronyistic a relationship between too many businesses and too many politicians. And that needs to be our next frontier, perhaps, in terms of how we're addressing the interface between the state and the private sector.
Excellent, thank you. I wonder if we can get into some technical details around anti-corruption agencies, and particularly around the issue of coordination. So we've had one question in the chat from Dr. Gitonga saying that the multi-agency approach seems to be the new way of doing things in the fight against corruption. But don't you think it has its own challenges? And I think one thing I've seen occasionally working in countries is that you get a lot of turf wars with different agencies thinking that this is their remit, and fighting over it, or alternatively something not being addressed because no one's quite sure whose remit it is. So that's sort of one issue. Similarly, on coordination, a big issue is around coordination not within a country but among countries. Corruption's a transnational problem. We often need to cooperate with other bodies. In fact, from the G20 last year, there was an initiative to set up a new coordination body among anti-corruption agencies. What are your thoughts on how that kind of coordination can be improved as well? So both, within countries and across countries, how can we do better at coordinating? Jungoh, I'll come to you first, and then we'll go to Laura and then Robert.
So coordination in the global level, I don't have enough experience. So I will highlight the significance of coordination mechanism, focusing on the country level by two angles. One, in horizontal aspect, an interagency committee was implemented between anti-corruption institutions and line ministries in South Korea. And in vertical aspect, monitoring and supporting roles were conducted by ACA with all levels of public institutions, including central and local governments, public enterprises, provincial education offices, public health institutions. So, supported by the government leadership, ACRC has tried to ensure the interagency coordination to make greater achievement in integrating anti-corruption objectives into government programs and resolving issues related with more than 2 ministries. In doing so, Korea has seen improvement in CPI during the period of its operation, particularly from 2004 to 2007 and from 2017 to 2020. So according to the question in the chat box, he said that challenge of a multi-agency approach, but in South Korea, although we have ACA for 20 years, we without interagency coordination mechanism, there are serious coordination problem because the head of ACA is minister, but other line ministries head are also ministers, so they are all in the same level. So when I contacted my focal point in the other ministries, they just say that I clearly know the importance of anti-corruption, but we have our own mission. So our perspective could be different from yours. So in this regard, ACRC highlighted that interagency committee is strongly important in the context of South Korea. And one more thing, in the political level, ACRC has exerted its efforts to ensure anti-corruption measures in public institutions because without commitment in each institution, national initiatives could not be functioned. So ACRC has assessed level of corruption and the level of to what extent anti-corruption activities are conducted in each agency and announced the assessment result to the public. At the same time, it offered technical assistance, particularly for underperforming agencies in the assessment. In the context of South Korea, we have recognized that without each agency's effort, anti-corruption agency and anti-corruption agency's functions couldn't be realized in the global level, in the country level, and in the subnational level.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Very interesting. Laura.
Yes, thank you. Before I go global or international coordination, I would say that one of the challenges that we are not going to address today for some big countries in the world is, again, federalism and subnational governments. You know, it's very complicated because maybe you can have a federal policy and some big subnational governments doing great, but you can also have in our countries, big countries, pockets for corruption, for example, in beneficial ownership registries, you know. So you may have little money laundering pockets in some provinces or regions or states, subnational states, that create a problem for the federal strategy or fight against corruption. But putting that aside for the next, you know, the next chapter of the governance of corruption in federal countries, you know, internationally about coordination, I think it's always, you know, as Robert was saying, okay, we need someone in the government, someone that we say, okay, this is the leader or this is the leading agency. And it's very important. It's one of the functions that we had in our office, which was to, you know, be the representatives of the Argentine government in international review mechanisms and other forums to share experiences, to learn from each other. However, this is great. However, I found, and I'm thinking about, again, how I hope we have the opportunity next year to have 6 months fellowship to discuss this, how we have to redesign completely the way our peer review mechanisms are operating. Because in some regions, it's a joke. And others are quite effective in some countries, but they are also start suffering because of political reasons, again, because of the political regimes. And I'm not speaking about Europe, but maybe yes. So, you know, there is a lot to do about that. And I hope, and I'm not doing a publicity of this and advertising this, but I made an application to study this and how to rewrite, as a new system, a new institutional international design to be effective. We don't need to have 5 or 6 different peer review mechanisms. We need to synergize and to think smart about what we want to get from each country. And we are not going to get the same development from Argentina and Denmark probably, but it's a stage, you know, it's a process of stages. So we need to redesign some of the things. There is a lot of money, a lot of people working there, a lot of bureaucracy, but a lot less progress. So I think that there is also an opportunity to rediscuss this international designs, because cooperation, international cooperation is key for many things, to investigate, to prosecute, to do policy, to learn from each other, and to start having international standards, for example, for procurement, for how we store data and we share data, how we use international artificial intelligence to counterpart corruption. And this needs to scale, you know, this needs to scale, but also go global and then come back with clear, not just recommendations for countries. We need to set clear agreements. So this is the way we store the data, this is the way we share the data, this is the way we collect the data, and we pull all this together to understand the world as a world. You know, this is global, and the problem is global, and the solutions also need to be global. And then we go local, and we will find a lot of new challenges, as we mentioned before.
Excellent, thank you. Robert.
Thank you. Well, I'll start from the opposite to Laura. I'll start on the international and then go back to the national. So on the international side on coordination, it's a widely acknowledged problem, of course, that we need more international coordination. But an equally widely acknowledged problem is that when you have a divergence of political points of view around what corruption is, let alone whether it should be prosecuted, whose jurisdiction applies, and so on, coordination is very hard. So, you know, in very stark terms, getting China and the US to agree on what corruption is, let alone how to coordinate about it, let alone about the repatriation of each other's citizens for an act of corruption, is actually extremely difficult. So, you know, I'm a bit suspicious about more and more coordination structures being set up, because I think that can look like a sort of excuse for activity, which isn't really addressing the fundamental problem that people don't really agree on what we're coordinating about. So, you know, my proposed solution to this is coalitions of countries that do agree. So it may be there is a group of countries that do agree on, you know, what corruption is, what is an act that requires action against it, and so on, and they should act collectively, but not try and, you know, I think getting agreement amongst the whole G20, for example, is very hard on those things, but amongst the G7, I think is probably more likely. So that would be my initial point. Going then on to the national level, you know, the coordination is clearly very, very hard, even within individual institutions, let alone amongst multiple agencies. And going back to those first principles in the chat at the beginning from D'Souza, durability is one of them. The fact that an agency is going to be here for a long time, and hopefully the personnel will be as well. And if you look at, you know, in any circumstance, what makes good coordination work, it's a combination of the right institutional structures and personal relationships. And having both of those in place for a long period is going to help your coordination. But, you know, I think there's a tendency to be disappointed when an anti-corruption mechanism hasn't worked within 18 months and then to change it. And actually, you know, we all know that for this to be successful, it's going to take 30 years at minimum, possibly 50 years. So actually, you need to design something that has that level of durability and people that are going to be within it for, you know, long periods as well. So, you know, for me, that durability point is really critical. But ultimately, I come back to the sort of the key point about, you know, who's conducting the orchestra here. who's ultimately in charge. That you can have all these agencies and good coordination, but it's never going to be perfect, and you need some person or body that is able to bring this together with sufficient authority and independence and resource. And I think certainly in the UK context, that's what we most lack. So I'm not optimistic about the coordination unless we get that aspect of the governance right.
Can I just keep us on the international side for a moment, but talk about, one of the other questions early on in the chat was about the difference between the infrastructure around anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism versus anti-corruption, and I think particularly grand corruption. So the question is, can you speak a bit more about the divergence between AML, CFT and sort of FATF recommendations and anti-corruption? And it does often seem to me too that we're steaming ahead in a way on the anti-money laundering side of things, but a bit weaker on the grand corruption. So if we could go Robert, Laura, Jungoh on that.
Thank you. I mean, I rather agree that, I don't think the international AML approach or the FATF approach is by any means perfect, by the way. And in fact, there was a great speech by the head of FATF, David Lewis, at Chatham House about a month ago, which I'd urge everybody to read. It's really interesting about, the things that FATF does not so well as the things it does well. So although it is to some extent steaming ahead compared to the anti-corruption arena, I don't think we should view that necessarily as an ideal model to follow. But I think your basic point is there seems to be a sort of activity and energy and coordination around that there isn't around corruption. And, my observation, which is very obvious, I think, is that it is easier to go after money than to go after people. It's less emotive in lots of ways. There's usually more obvious criminality involved. There is an evidence trail that's provable. Those sort of things. Coordination on corruption is very hard. But we all know that if we had an international corruption court that was operating properly, people like Vladimir Putin would be in it. Well, of course, that's never going to happen. And the international mechanisms that we have, things like UNCAC, we know are serially undermined by a number of governments that don't really want them to work properly. From that point of view, the forthcoming UN General Assembly special session in June will be really fascinating to see the interplay between the global powers on this. Will the Biden administration flex its muscles in the way that previous US administrations have, and can it flex its muscles, given that there is a counterweight in the world now of possibly equal strength, but one that doesn't share the same vision with regard to tackling corruption? So if I look back to the anti-corruption summit that was held in London in 2016, it was never publicly expressed, but it was clear that one of the reasons the US and the UK convened that summit was a big frustration with the international system not working well, a sense that UNCAC was not doing its job, really. The summit was trying to get a coalition of countries that really wanted to progress faster. And I think that philosophy is still probably right, basically. I think as long as you have global conventions which require everybody to move at the same speed, you're going to have a lowest common denominator effect. And around corruption, that is a very low common denominator because there are so many interested parties in power that don't want it to be successful. But I think there is scope for a sort of faster track to develop amongst countries that want that fast track and where there is some kind of political will. That would be my take on it. But I agree that with the sort of proposition that the AML side of things seems to go a bit faster and further sometimes. There are, I think, obvious reasons for that, but I don't think that needs to hold back the whole global effort on corruption, though at the moment it does seem to be.
Thanks, Robert. Laura, any reflections on going after money versus people?
Yes, I share what Robert was saying, but we need to fix all the bureaucracy at some point, the international bureaucracy, because we can do coalitions of countries around an issue that has, where there is agreement and you can show success maybe in 5 or 10 years with new policy, and this is great and fantastic, and we have to move forward. But this also creates a bigger gap between developing countries and developed countries. So I applaud the G7, but you are further and further far away from the rest of the world, from, you know, from us. And some of the guys here, you know, in the South, we want to do things right. We want to be taken into account. It's very difficult, but we want to move forward in a positive way. So, you know, I love big countries leading by example, and not by example sometimes, but correcting what they have to correct. And this is good. But also it's important the effort that a lot of people are doing in different sectors in developing countries to move this agenda forward. As you said, I see more and more some countries speaking about transnational kleptocracy and going after the money and not the people. You know, the criminal approach gives you headlines in the media, but it doesn't solve the problem. To solve the problem, you need policy reforms and sustainable policy reforms. So, you know, the US has sanctioned Maduro for years, and Maduro is there because he's receiving money from other political powers in the world. So this is what's going on in that huge level in the playing, you know, in the playing field. That's first level of the playing field. But then we have domestic corruption, we have grand corruption, petty corruption. So this is huge and plenty of possibilities. That's why I still support multi-agency approach, but also, as Robert said, it's good to have something or someone, but don't think that that agency will solve all the problem. Network inside your government and with others is important. The criminal approach, it's okay, but it's not enough. You need policy. And you need educational policy, you need, you know, infrastructure, digital policy, digitization, artificial intelligence, everything that I have said before, and of course, global cooperation. And sometimes you don't find that. And also, Robert was saying before about conflicts of interest. And it's a mess, you know, I was the authority to solve that issue, and all the laws and regulations are very old. The US has, in a way, not failed, I don't want to say failed, but had huge problems in the past administration with conflicts of interest. And still we are wondering what's going to happen. But in some countries, we don't even have, as I said before, professional public administrations. So revolving door is almost the normal thing. People, you know, maybe you come into the public administration for some time, they pay very low, then you go back to a private practice, then you come back. So this is something that happens in many developing countries. So it creates opportunities for corruption, for this sort of corruption. And yes, we need to think how to solve this, but not in a, I would say not in a moral way, but in a convenient way, because sometimes you bring people from the private sector that bring talents and information and intelligence that you don't have in the administration. And in these countries, this needs to be addressed too, with this, you know, with this way of looking at things. Because now for example, I look at my former agency, and a lot of people were dismissed, professionals. And from the professional point of view and technical point of view, it has been weakened. And this happens in these countries. And sometimes we need to address this when we speak about conflicts of interest. It's not like in the US, it's not like in Australia. You know, we are different types of countries. So maybe, you know, your solutions may work for you, but they might not work for us because we have different contexts. And institutions are created and function in their contexts. And this is why we need to embed our analysis and our recommendations also in national and regional context, and even historical processes. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Jungoh.
Yeah, I think that some global anti-corruption issues, such as anti-money laundering and beneficial ownership, it seems that Korea needs more proactive attitude for this global issue. Yeah, for example, for example, anti-money laundering mechanism, South Korea is not free from this problem because there is a suspicion that one of the former Korean president has secret account in Switzerland. So many CSO, civil society organizations, claimed that we should return the account to the country, but unfortunately, this anti-money laundering mechanism is initiated by the prosecutor's office. So the prosecutor's office are not proactive for this problem because they are investigative agency, not corruption prevention agency. So they strongly argue that if we don't have enough evidence, we do not have much further step for this kind of suspicion. But ACRC relatively doesn't have enough power to handle this issue. So that we cannot engage in this very critical issue. And in terms of beneficial ownership, in 2016, the Minister of Justice in South Korea also participated in the Global Summit in London, and he declared that South Korea will establish beneficial ownership in line with global standard. But until now, South Korea had assessed by the OECD for this beneficial ownership legal and institutional framework, but the results were not successful. And this issue is also conducted by a more powerful ministry, for example, Financial Intelligence Unit and National Tax Agency. So ACRC couldn't engage in this issue as well. So yeah, when I return to South Korea, I propose this global issue to my chairperson in ACRC. In the global level, these issues are strongly important, and we should not ignore this voice from the global community. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my final question to each of you, where I'm looking for very short answers, is going to be, how do you tell if your system for governing corruption is working? And I'm going to go first to Laura. Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's a very difficult answer, but I think that if you have less corruption scandals throughout some time, or if you have some and they are good and they are correctly solved by the judiciary, it's working. If not, you have to do a lot. You know, and we are not operating still properly. We need to do more.
Okay, great. Robert?
Horrible question. You know, I think first off, it's worthwhile saying there's a huge difference between academics and practitioners in terms of what they consider success or failure to be. So it depends who you ask. I'll say something which I know will be very controversial. I think one quite good way still is to look at your CPI score. And I know, you know, lots of people hate that, but I actually think having studied it myself for years and years and years, it's not a bad way of telling how successful you are being.
Great. And Jungoh?
Yeah, I want to close my comment about ACA's successful factors, ACA's successful implementation factor. So reflecting experience in South Korea, ACA itself cannot guarantee to ensure anti-corruption performance. Rather, its function has been largely affected by three factors. First, political commitment is an overarching factor to materialize anti-corruption objectives by providing legal support and resources. And second, capacity is an enabling factor to implement anti-corruption policies as intended, but it needs significant efforts to develop. And last, Without resource, without funding and staffing, no government function is to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jungoh. So we have hit the end of the session. I would just like to say thank you to everyone. Thank you for the brilliant speakers and also fantastic interventions. I think we often talk in anti-corruption about this being something which has both a political and a technical aspect. And I think there's nowhere where it's more true than when thinking about this issue of the governance of corruption. Thank you very much all for joining. We're finished there.
Thank you, Liz. Excellent sharing.
Thank you. Fantastic intervention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.